Among the many psychological types outlined by Carl Jung, there is one that occupies a unique place, not only due to its rarity, but also because of the psychic complexity it carries, the intuitive introvert. According to Jung, this personality represents one of the most difficult modes to understand, both by others and by oneself. It is not a type oriented towards external action, the world of facts or observable emotions. On the contrary, it lives connected to a symbolic flow that emerges from the unconscious, guided by inner images, premonitions, and archetypal structures that escape common perception. This type does not operate from linear logic or empirical observation. Its compass is internal. It captures meanings that are not yet formed, perceives psychic movements before they become conscious, and is guided by a deep sensitivity to the invisible. The concrete world, with its practical demands and rational codes, often seems banal or irrelevant to it. And not because it is arrogant or disinterested, but because its attention is directed towards another dimension, a symbolic plane that often anticipates the present time. For it, facts are shadows of something more essential that is still in gestation. Jung described this type as someone who perceives what is about to be, but is not yet. It is a perception oriented towards potential, towards the psychic virtual, towards what is forming in the collective unconscious. This way of functioning makes the intuitive introvert sensitive to cultural, spiritual, and existential transformations that announce themselves before they become visible. But this sensitivity, as powerful as it may be, comes at a price. The world around it does not operate on the same frequency. Society demands proof, results, objective data. And what this type perceives by its very nature is intangible, at least initially. The result of this is an abyss between what it sees internally and what the world expects from it. Its perceptions are often ridiculed, ignored, or pathologized. It is the kind of person who intuits something essential about someone they have just met, who feels ruptures in the air before events occur, who senses outcomes long before the facts are confirmed. But when it tries to communicate this, it almost always encounters silence or rejection. Over time, it learns to remain silent, to keep its inner world as a private and impenetrable space. And it is precisely in this silence that the true danger begins. Jung left a clear warning. When this type does not find ways to translate its visions into language, art, or concrete action, it risks being consumed by them. The inner world, which should be a source of revelation, becomes a prison. Symbolic images, when not integrated into consciousness, begin to dominate the psyche with an autonomous force, and the subject ceases to be the one who contemplates. They become the one who is possessed by the images. It is here that Jung's dark warning takes shape. The gift of deep intuition, if not balanced, can turn into a process of dissociation. In this video, we will explore this trajectory in detail. We will understand how this type functions, what its specific dangers are, and above all, what transformative potential it carries when it manages to find a path of expression and integration. The journey of the intuitive introvert is not easy, but it is also not trivial. It is a journey between worlds, and understanding this crossing can illuminate not only those who live this psychic configuration, but also those who wish to comprehend the deeper mysteries of the human soul. In Jung's typological system, intuition is considered one of the irrational functions of the psyche. That is, a form of perception that does not rely on logic or sensory experience. However, in the case of the introverted intuitive type, this function takes on a deeply internalized direction. Unlike extroverted intuition, which seeks possibilities in the external environment, introverted intuition turns inward to the depths of the unconscious. It captures not what is visible, but what emerges from the more archaic and symbolic layers of the psyche, often without warning, context, or immediate explanation. Jung described this function as the ability to perceive raw psychic images, symbolic forms that have not yet been transformed into thought, feeling, or action. The introverted intuitive type lives in constant contact with these images. They do not see with the eyes of the body, but with the eyes of the soul. What seems like an ordinary situation to others may carry hidden meanings, invisible tensions, patterns that repeat silently for them. Their mind operates like an antenna turned inward, picking up signals that have no language but possess weight, form, and psychic energy. This sensitivity, when integrated, is a powerful source of insight. The introverted intuitive is capable of perceiving the deep meaning of events, understanding the unconscious motivations of others, and anticipating changes before they become perceptible. However, on the other hand, this same sensitivity makes them vulnerable to internal dispersion. As the sensation function, responsible for maintaining contact with the present and the body, is often the most underdeveloped in this type. They can easily drift away from objective reality. Intuition then begins to function autonomously, disconnected from practical experience, and the individual gets lost in an ocean of internal images. This inner architecture is not chaotic, but it is also not controllable. Symbolic images arise out of psychic necessity, not conscious choice. When well directed, these visions can become seeds of creation, ideas that transform, symbols that heal, narratives that reveal. But if they are not understood and processed, they can accumulate as psychic noise, leading to confusion, paralysis, and the collapse of rational function. The individual then begins to live not in the world, but in a kind of self-reinforcing parallel reality. For the introverted intuitive, understanding the workings of their own intuition is the first step to not being enslaved by it. They need to learn to distinguish what is a revealing symbol from what is baseless fantasy, and this requires time, silence, and internal structure. But it also demands a warning. No matter how fascinating this internal world may be, it holds traps. The next part of the video will specifically address these traps, especially the moment when symbolic vision, without finding expression, begins to transform into delusion. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. Introverted intuition has a characteristic that makes it simultaneously fascinating and dangerous. It does not operate in the present time. Its nature is directed towards what is to come, towards that which is not yet, but insinuates itself at the edges of consciousness. The introverted intuitive type lives as if inhabiting the threshold between now and not yet. They sense the approach of events, perceive archetypal changes in the psychic and cultural fabric before they manifest in concrete form. This capacity for anticipation makes them, in Jung's words, akin to a prophet, someone who sees what others cannot yet see. But there is a fundamental dilemma in this position. What is seen cannot be proven. What is felt cannot be justified with facts. And what is intuited rarely finds resonance in others. This creates a constant conflict between the inner clarity of vision and the lack of external recognition. The introverted intuitive begins to doubt themselves, or else takes refuge in their perception with such absolute conviction that they reject the world around them. In both cases, the tension between the perceived invisible and the denied visible begins to corrode the psyche. One of the most powerful examples cited by Jung is that of a patient who described, during the analytical process, the image of a black snake lodged in her abdomen. As the treatment progressed, this snake began to rise within her body until it emerged from her mouth and transformed into a serpent with a golden head. For many, this would seem like a delirious fantasy. But Jung interpreted the image as a clear symbol of inner transformation, a process of individuation taking visual form through the unconscious. The black snake represented the repressed content that, when integrated, was reborn as a symbol of healing. This example accurately illustrates the functioning of introverted intuition. It does not speak with logic, but with images. It does not point to causes, but reveals destinies. The problem arises when these images do not find an external language, when the symbol is not translated into creation, reflection, or action. At this point, the vision, once revealing, begins to close in on itself. The mind loses the ability to distinguish what is insight from what is illusion, and what was symbolic wisdom becomes solitary delirium. The boundary between revelation and delirium is extremely subtle, and the introverted intuitive walks upon it every day. In order for intuition not to turn into a psychic labyrinth, it is essential to understand which mechanisms can lead to a rupture with reality. In the next part, we will explore exactly this process. The moment when the symbol, by not being expressed, begins to dominate the subject completely, leading to archetypal inflation and the loss of the sense of reality. The intuitive introverted type is, by nature, a solitary individual, not by preference, but by psychic structure. Their attention is directed towards what cannot be seen, towards what has not yet taken shape, towards that which emerges from the unconscious in symbols, visions, and premonitions. However, this inner orientation, when it does not find a means of expression or mediation with the external world, creates a fertile space for identity crises, and in more extreme cases, for delusions of grandeur. Jung called this process inflatio, the moment when the ego is inflated by unconscious contents and begins to identify with powerful archetypes without perceiving its limits. This phenomenon occurs subtly. The intuitive introverted individual, by perceiving deep symbolic patterns, may begin to believe that they have been chosen for a special mission. This sense of uniqueness, although initially legitimate as a reflection of their sensitivity, can transform into a messianic illusion. The individual starts to see themselves as a bearer of absolute truths, an unrecognized visionary, a prophet rejected by a blind society. Criticism from others is interpreted as persecution. Doubt is seen as a sign of others' inferiority. Isolation deepens, not as a consequence, but as a justification. No one understands me because I am more evolved. This type of psychic inflation is dangerous because it dissolves self-criticism. The individual begins to live within their own symbolic narrative with no clear distinction between what is archetypal content and what is concrete reality. They identify with images from the unconscious, the wise one, the martyr, the prophet, and lose contact with their ordinary humanity. This over-identification with archetypes leads to psychic fragmentation. The intuitive function, which once offered glimpses of meaning, transforms into a vehicle of escape. Practical life is neglected, relationships become merely instrumental, and any contradiction is rejected as a threat to the inner vision. Jung observed that this pattern was common in personalities that emotionally isolated themselves and resisted any form of adaptation to the world. The greater danger, according to him, was not the isolation itself, but what came afterward. The complete colonization of consciousness by the unconscious. When this happens, the ego ceases to mediate reality and becomes merely a passive receptacle of symbolic images. Perception becomes distorted, judgment is contaminated, and existence begins to move in a subtly delirious fantasy realm, where everything seems to make sense, but nothing is rooted in the real. Still, not every contact with the symbol leads to collapse. There is an antidote, and it begins with the capacity for expression, the ability to translate the invisible into form, word, gesture, or art. When the symbolic vision finds a way to exit the private sphere, and manifest in the world. It transforms from prison into creation. In the next part, we will see just that. How intuitive figures who manage to channel their visions, like Kafka, Van Gogh, and Jung himself, transformed their internal perceptions into works that altered collective consciousness. The psychic survival of the intuitive introverted type largely depends on their ability to transform the invisible into form. For Jung, the unexpressed symbol tends to become an autonomous agent within the psyche, acting as a foreign body that has not been digested by consciousness. The only way to integrate these internal images is by offering them a contour in the external world. Symbolic expression, whether through art, writing, music, or rituals, is not an aesthetic luxury. It is a vital necessity. This process of translating the symbol into the real is what differentiates the creative visionary from the fragmented mystic. When the intuitive introverted type finds a way to externalize their perceptions, they transform their symbolic solitude into communication, their strangeness into language, their isolation into impact. What was an internal labyrinth becomes a shareable map. And this act of creation has a dual effect. It not only relieves internal psychic tension, but also offers the collective access to contents that were previously only in the unconscious. History is full of examples of figures who most likely operated from this intuitive introverted function. Franz Kafka, with his labyrinthine and dreamlike texts, channeled his symbolic alienation into works that still capture the absurdity of modern existence. Vincent van Gogh, unable to adapt to the practical world, poured his emotional and symbolic vision into explosive brushstrokes, each painting a desperate attempt to translate a boiling soul. Even Jung, who recognized this type in himself, wrote his deepest works as attempts to translate complex internal experiences into comprehensible systems. But it is not just about genius or talent. What these examples show is that symbolic expression is the bridge between the inner world and the outer world. When this bridge does not exist, the symbol accumulates, closes in on itself, and begins to distort the perception of reality. But when there is a way out, the inner image becomes work, gesture, word, and this reorganizes the psyche. The intuitive function ceases to operate in the dark and begins to collaborate with consciousness. Creativity, then, is not just a gift, it is a process of psychological integration. However, even the richest symbolic expression may not be enough if there is no rooting in the real. The intuitive introverted type, by their structure, tends to neglect the body, routine, and concrete limits. And this exposes them to new risks. Creation can become compulsion. Inspiration can turn into escape. True integration only happens when the symbol also finds a sensory basis, when intuition is balanced by sensation. In the next part, we will explore this fundamental aspect. How simple practices, connected to the body and the earth, can serve as an antidote against psychic dissolution. If what you're hearing resonates with you, you'll find real value in my ebook, Beyond the Shadow. It breaks down Jung's core ideas and gives you tools to understand yourself more deeply. Link is in the pinned comment. The intuitive function, especially in its introverted form, operates outside of time, the body, and linearity. It dives into the unconscious, gathers symbols and premonitions, and returns to the surface carrying visions that do not belong to the concrete world. This ability is what gives the introverted intuitive type its enigmatic brilliance, but it is also what weakens it. Without an anchor, without a solid foundation in the present, this intuition risks becoming a whirlpool. And that is why Jung emphasized the importance of integrating the inferior function, sensation, Sensation is the function responsible for keeping us connected to the now, to the body, to the material world. It perceives what is tangible, the warmth of the sun on the skin, the bitter taste of coffee, the weight of an object in the hands. For the introverted intuitive, who tends to neglect these perceptions as mundane or irrelevant, sensation seems almost like a foreign language. But it is precisely this language that can provide the antidote to excessive abstraction. It is in the materiality of simple things that this type can find balance. In walking, cooking, tending to plants, practicing a manual craft, or simply maintaining a routine. The return to the body, to routine, and to the present time does not deny symbolic depth. It sustains it. When the type manages to alternate between intuitive diving and concrete practice, their visions cease to be labyrinths and become roots. They become capable of moving between worlds, the internal and the external, the invisible and the tangible. This transit is what characterizes true psychic maturity. The symbol then ceases to be an object of passive contemplation and transforms into a real guiding force that shapes life, decisions, and relationships. Not as an oracle, but as a compass. Everyday rituals assume in this context a therapeutic function. They do not need to be grand or esoteric. They can be as simple as lighting a candle at dawn, writing in a notebook at the end of the day, or intentionally organizing a workspace. These small acts create an axis in the internal chaos. They are gestures that tell the unconscious, there is order, there is body, there is reality. And it is in this ritualized space that the symbol can descend to earth without exploding the psyche. The integration of sensation is not a limitation. It is what allows intuition to flourish more strongly. But even when there is symbolic expression and anchoring in the real, the introverted intuitive type faces a final challenge. Living their truth in a world that generally rejects everything that cannot be measured, explained, or monetized. How to sustain their vision in an environment dominated by logic, productivity, and immediacy. How to continue listening to internal symbols when the external world demands obedience to the concrete. This is the final clash, and it will be the theme of the last part of this video. Even when the intuitive introverted type develops means of symbolic expression and builds practices of anchoring in reality, they still face an obstacle that few perceive, and which may be the hardest of all: sustaining their own inner truth in a world that systematically rejects the invisible. Modern culture, focused on the concrete, the immediate, and the measurable, values objective results, statistical data, productivity, and visible performance. Deep intuitions, symbolic visions, and silent reflections are not only ignored, they are often ridiculed, pathologized, or dismissed as irrelevant. For the intuitive introverted individual, this creates a constant tension between fidelity to their own soul and the need to adapt. At every moment, they find themselves faced with a choice: betray their inner vision to fit into the collective discourse, or remain true to themselves, even if it means marginalization, misunderstanding, and loneliness. And this choice is not theoretical. It presents itself in the details of everyday life. In conversations where they need to silence what they truly think. In environments where their silence is interpreted as weakness. In jobs where they cannot express what they see, feel, or sense, under the threat of being considered inappropriate. But this tension does not have to lead to resignation. Jung argued that the process of individuation requires exactly this: sustaining the symbolic core of the self even amidst the opposing forces of collectivity. Living one's symbolic truth for the intuitive introverted individual is not withdrawing from the world. It is navigating through it without losing the internal axis. It is knowing that the vision they carry may never be fully recognized, yet still needs to be lived. Because in the end, the function of intuition is not to please, convince, or win. It is to point to paths that do not yet exist. Living symbolically in a materialistic society is a silent act of resistance. It is choosing depth over appearance, meaning over convenience. It is sustaining a connection with the invisible even when everything around says it has no value. But this type, when they find the courage to remain true to what they see, becomes a transformative figure. Not by imposing themselves on the world, but by revealing, with their presence, that there is something beyond the surface. And this revelation, no matter how subtle, has the power to touch, disturb, and inspire those who are ready to perceive. If you feel that you belong to this invisible world, if you live among symbols, intuitions, and premonitions that few understand, share in the comments how you have dealt with this crossing. What strategies have you found to remain whole? How do you balance the inner world with the external reality? Your response may help others who live the same silent dilemma. And don't forget to watch the next video. It may be the natural continuation of this reflection and may offer the missing key to deepen this dive even further. It's important. See you there.